Religion in general today. I don't know how long. As usual, I'm not really prepared for this, and Dr. Shin and I seem to like this spontaneity and this open-endedness of our talks. Spontaneity happening without thought or preparation. I've been putting together some thoughts about religion. I've studied it for a long time. I've taught it at the university level, various kinds of courses, and so I welcome this opportunity to talk about it generally a little bit. Where to begin? All religions originate in the mystical experience of someone. All religions. Now, a mystic is a person who has had, or seeks communion with the divine. Communion is not communication, it's communion. This is not verbal, not words, with the supernatural in some form. If we look at the founders of the major religions of the world, if we look at, say, Moses, who was a perfect mystic, who is said to have entered his tent and talked with God and listened to God, who begins with a theophany, Theophny, that is an appearance of God to him in the burning bush in Exodus. Moses is a perfect example of such a mystic. The Buddha is another such mystic. What is most remarkable about him is that he refused to talk about the nature of God, the existence of God. He considered these questions, I think, a waste of time, because God, being infinite, eternal, all the words that can be used of God, as people like to say, or as the wise say, one cannot predicate anything about God. God cannot be limited by language, by human definitions, by human thoughts, and all of our language and thoughts and definitions are hopelessly inadequate and distorting. And I admire the Buddha for that. He focused on the problem of human suffering and what, if anything, could be done to eliminate human suffering. But still, he was a mystic. That is, what he proposed was a way to find nirvana, a word that means extinction, but a word that meant, in the context of Indian religion, escape from the wheel of birth, death, rebirth, that infinite or that eternal wheel. And nirvana is certainly a mystical proposition. Anyway, continuing, Jesus, a perfect mystic, to a Christian much more than a mystic, but the fact is that he communed with God, whom he regarded as Father and whom he called Abba, Father. He is perhaps the perfect mystic, even from the point of view of other religions, because he seldom was not communing with God, as the Gospels tell about him and as the Gospels describe him. Muhammad, though, certainly a mystic, a great mystic, and choose others. Joseph Smith of Mormon, of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, so-called. Even Luther, Martin Luther, Calvin, even, I suppose, and various others, all mystics. So, if we begin with the premise, the basic statement, that all religions begin with someone's mystical experience, then the second phase of all religions involves two aspects. The attempt to set down, to formulate in words whatever it is these mystics taught, their teachings, to reduce them really to words, to ideas, to doctrines. This seems to be a necessary step, but inevitably it causes lots of confusion, lots of compromises. Basically, at this point, religion becomes involved in politics, in the jostling of human personalities and individual human agendas and personal ambitions and a whole many things. So doctrines, I suggest, as one aspect of the second phase. The second aspect is just as damaging, but just as necessary, and that is the creation of some organization. Now, organization has been the mark especially of Western religions. By the way, I didn't mention Hinduism before, what we in the West call Hinduism, because it's not really an organized religion at all, and it has no clear founder. The other world religions all have clear, indisputably clear founders. Hinduism has no clear founder. In fact, a better name for Hinduism is probably just Indian religion, but that's too broad. Anyway, it's a big exception. And nor does it have very clear doctrines. It has many doctrines, many teachers, but it has some generally agreed upon doctrines, agreed upon. But skipping back then, the second phase involved then the formulation, the putting into words of what it is these great religious ideas are, what it is the great mystics said or believed or experienced, and the second phase, some form of organization. As I was saying, the West loves organization. Generally, Eastern religions have been much less concerned about organization, hierarchy, political structure, things like that. But the West has been obsessed with it. And so it is that Christianity, Judaism to a lesser extent, but Islam too, have all been involved in this kind of political activity. On the other hand, these just seem to be part of the cultures that these religions found homes in. Because religion in the end is a cultural phenomenon. That is, religion without culture is unthinkable. Religion is not simply a set of abstract doctrines, that things people can list off and say in a creed, I believe this, 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 and this. Religion has to be lived in some culture, and so it interacts with the culture. It influences the culture influences it. And this complex is inevitable. But if we ask what happened to the mystics' original perceptions, what happened to the mystics' original experiences, we have to admit that in any organized religion, the distance between those original experiences and the final product in some institution, in a church, or in an institution as teachings, creeds, the distance is pretty large. Now, in the West, to take, say, the Catholic Church as the crowning example, religion equals the experience and teachings of the founder, Jesus, the experience and teachings also of his immediate followers, and the institution of the church through the centuries, all of that is religion. So the institution is part of the religion, and the Catholic Church is especially aggressive about that. Other religions are less aggressive about the place of the institution in the religion itself. Frankly, I think for other religions, the institution is an embarrassment. The Catholic Church, though, tries to make something glorious of it, and succeeds, or has succeeded sometimes. But anyway, so what happens then in these individual religions? How we have to realize then that religions also evolve. Evolution, evolve. A religion is a historical phenomenon. The beliefs of any Christian, whichever church he or she might belong to, are quite different from, whatever we say, from the beliefs of the Christian community in the years following the death, the crucifixion of Christ, different from the teachings of Paul. Just to take Paul, Paul is only one, after all, of the authors of the New Testament. When we think about the canonical, the formation of the canon, C-A-N-O-N, the canon means those works that are accepted as authoritative, authority. That is, those works that are accepted as valid, as accepted, as orthodox. We realize that many texts were not accepted as part of the canon. And we realize that some works are extra-canonical, outside of the canon, the accepted works. And we realize that at every step of the way, a religion is involved in historical processes, in evolution, in change, is affected by history, is affected by politics, is affected by all kinds of cultural phenomena. It's an evolving historical thing. This is inescapable, inevitable, inescapable, inevitable. Is this good or bad? I think one cannot say that it's good or bad. It simply is. To try to get to the pure origin of any religion is impossible. It was even impossible at the time of Christ. It was even impossible then. It was even impossible for his followers, or the followers of Muhammad, or the followers of the Buddha, or the followers of Moses. It was and is impossible to discover or to understand or to find the original inspiration, the original ideas, the original feelings even of any religion. So one must accept that it is a historical phenomenon. Okay, is this good or bad? Again, it simply is. Now, if we look at Christianity to start with, a big question that became big, especially in the 19th century in the West, with the invention, by the way, let me call it an invention, because history is an invention. History, after all, is simply an idea or a body of ideas that we impose upon the past. History is a somewhat arbitrary, that is somebody's idea. It's not as if it really was. It's somebody's idea of what happened. Really, history, the whole concept of history, is an outgrowth of the scientific revolution of modern times. The invention of history is true. It can be traced back to before Christ, Herodotus, the Greek, Thucydides, the Greek. I mentioned Thucydides the other day. The great historian of the Old Testament was the author of 2 Samuel, chapters 9 through 20, which is called the court narrative, or the court narrative, the story of David and his court and the things that happened there. That was history too. But mostly history by the 19th century was an attempt to impose a kind of scientific view on the past. Well, this is an illusion, ILL, an illusion. This, of course, is impossible. But just as people try very hard to believe in science and the things that science tells us, just as people try very hard to believe that science can discover truth, people also try to believe that history can discover some kind of truth. Both of these, I think, are illusions. But moving on, the idea of history in the 19th century was so huge, and it still is, that this idea was imposed not just on Christianity, but on the Bible. How historical is the Bible? The four Gospels, which in earlier centuries seemed to tell from a historical point of view, accurately, tell the story of Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ. When the 19th century examined these documents, suddenly people realized, wait a minute, this is not history at all. This doesn't even pretend to be history. The word kerygma was often used. Kerygma means proclamation, announcement, proclaim, proclamation. And the Gospels were seen as expressions of religious history, or kerygma, that is, a combination of what happened and the religious interpretation of what happened. Well, this was a shock to the 19th century. And then, early in the 20th century, some really great theologian scholars, Bultmann is the most famous, I think, Rudolf Bultmann, the German, set to work to try to determine which elements in the Gospels are historical. And in the end, he concluded that it's impossible to say. One cannot make any clear statement amounting to much more than Jesus lived and died in Palestine from some date, around some date to around some date. One cannot find in the Gospels any clear historical Jesus. That is because the element of kerygma, which of course is very close to myth. Now, myth is a dangerous word, I know, but what I'm going to suggest to you is that myth, I believe myth is all we have. I believe science to be a myth, history certainly to be a myth, and religion to be a myth too. Now, what do I mean by myth? Well, I assume that we human beings cannot have knowledge of anything. Certain knowledge of anything is impossible. Knowledge of anything at all. We can't prove anything, that's for sure. We can't prove anything even about our own lives. From our physical reality to our physical existence to anything. Now, when we get into things like feelings and ideas, we realize that we can't even say what we think, say what we feel, because language is such a very crude and imperfect tool. And I think then what we are left with is lots of myths. Now, is this something bad? It's only something bad if we believe that we have to know something. Now, I believe that Western man especially, but man in general, man's deep desire to know is exactly man's sin in Genesis. That is, that wonderful myth, and there is a pure myth, of Adam and Eve, eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, is a profound myth about man's desire to know with certainty something, to have knowledge of good and evil, in other words, to be as God. But we're a silly race, we human beings. We should realize that we can't know anything. We never have, we never will. That knowledge is absolutely impossible. And that knowledge, perhaps, is even the source of our misery, of our unhappiness, of this craze for knowledge is even the source of our sin, ultimately. Now, so what I mean by myth is that myth is all we have, and we should, it seems to me, we can be happy with our myths. And some of our myths are beautiful and profound, and some of our myths are silly. I personally think that the myth of science is a little bit silly. The myth of history is very silly. And the myth of knowledge of anything is kind of silly. So I'm very skeptical about all these things. But skepticism can be the basis of faith. When one realizes that one can't know anything, then of course one can maybe turn to God, let's call God, and try to believe in and commune with, if one is big enough and spiritual enough, with what may be called God. But which God? Because it seems to me that all of our organized religions, all of our religions are also nothing but myths too. We have nothing but myths. We have myths about Jesus, we have myths about Muhammad, we have myths about the Buddha, myths about Moses. Historical, I think none of it, because history is a myth. And even if we could know something about these people, we could not express their ideas in language, because their ideas were mystical. And mysticism goes beyond far what we can do with language. After all, we can't do much with language anyway. I literally cannot say how I feel. The words that I use, if I'm angry, or happy, or lonely, or in pain, the words that I have to use are so general, so ambiguous, so imprecise, so subject to change, and my feelings, after all, are so subject to change constantly, that by the time I even say how I feel, probably I feel different. Our words are always miles behind our feelings, miles behind our thoughts. Our words are almost full of memories, because it's all past. Putting it another way, our feelings and thoughts are so quick that our words cannot possibly keep up with them. I would think that at some times, speaking for myself, and I think everyone's the same, I'm able to express 1,000th maybe, I'll just say 1,000th, I don't know, of the feelings and thoughts that I have. And those I express badly, according to the rules of grammar, which are very crude, very general, very silly. Grammar itself, language itself is a myth. Language is a myth. Try that one. Of course, any aspect of language is a myth. Ultimately, any word is a myth. That is, we all agree in one language that this means table, right? Or that this means love. But it's, after all, just a sound or a set of marks on paper which we all agree to have some certain very general, very vague, very imprecise meaning, which doesn't correspond at all, I think, to the feelings or thoughts that these are supposed to correspond to. Okay, so I'm very skeptical about all these things, but as I'm saying, this kind of skepticism, skeptical, skepticism, can be the foundation of faith, because it seems to me faith is maybe all we have. The problem is, faith in what? Faith in the mythical constructions of the organized religions? I find them just too unacceptable. I find the myths of Christianity, things like the virgin birth, an idea like the Trinity, things like even the resurrection, that's a rough one. An event like the transfiguration, the miracles, water to wine, Lazarus. Choose the miracle you want. I find them just so beyond what I can believe, and that I think they are pure imagination, or as Hume, a favorite of mine, David Hume, 18th century Scottish philosopher, says it about miracles, for example. He says it's much easier to believe that the stupidity and the knavery, K-N-A-V-E-R-Y, knavery means mischief, M-I-S-C-H-I-E-F, that is tricks, dishonesty. It's much easier to believe that the miracles come from the stupidity and dishonesty of people than it is to believe in the miracles themselves. I find that very convincing. Anyway, getting back to this, believe in what then? I would describe myself as a deist, that is a theist, not a deist God, a theist in the broadest sense of the word. That is, I believe with Tillich, Paul Tillich, and with some, I think, in the end, with most theologians who think about it, that the mythical figures that we have in our various religions are simply that. They are myths. They help orient us toward a spiritual life, toward thoughts about something higher, but they are very arbitrary. They are very often silly, I think, but they're the best we can do. Underline, beyond Muhammad, beyond Allah, beyond God, beyond Yahweh, beyond the Christian God, beyond the Bodhisattvas and Shiva and Vishnu and all these mythical figures, which are obviously mythical figures, is some deity. And even that, there we're in trouble, because what is deity? Deity is a very broad general term meaning some vast power. All words are inadequate. Vast power, infinite, eternal, creator, maybe, of the universe, though not necessarily, force that is responsible for the miracle of life, but then I get into trouble because I have trouble believing that this vast force, this vast deity, is a personal God. I have trouble believing that this personal God can be too concerned. Notice, there's a key word here. Anthropomorphism. Anthro, man. Anthropo, actually a man. Morphism. Anthropomorphism. That is the tendency that we human beings have to endow, E-N-D-O-W, our deities with human forms, human language, human speech, human moods, anger, love, joy, forgiveness. I'm sorry, but I think this this just is too unacceptably mythical. Man is a little creature in this vast universe. Human history is a tiny moment in this vast universe. I can well believe, and John Hick, the dominant Protestant theologian in English anyway of the past 40 years, I think, has come this way too, I see. in reincarnation, that is, an endless, eternal repetition of the universe's history. I can believe in that. Why not? I can't prove it. I can't disprove it. But my point is, I have trouble thinking about a personal God. I have trouble thinking about the connection between morality and religion, because really I think there is none. We'll have to discuss that sometime if we get a chance. Well, let's discuss for a moment now. What is the connection between morality and religion? Reality and theism? I think most people worry that if morality is divorced from religion and God and religious sanctions, that we will all kill each other in a vast anarchy. I think this is nonsense. Morality is a creation of a culture, often imposed on a religion, sometimes imposed by a religion. If it happened that we had no religions, would we still have morality? Of course. Morality is the creation of a culture, of cultures, and as Hume says, we have morality so that social life becomes possible, so that social intercourse becomes possible, because without morality it's not. What about the divine sanctions? What about the moral teachings of the myths of our gods? I think fiction. Personally, I think fictions. Is this a cause for despair? D-E-S-P-A-I-R? No. If God is impersonal, that is not personally involved with me, and you, and us, is this a cause of despair? No. Now, another big topic. Most people want out of religion two things, I think. They want some sanction for morality, and they want deliverance from death. That is, they want eternal life. If religion cannot provide these two things, they're not interested. That is, from a somewhat cynical point of view, I suppose, what we want out of religion are those two things. We want guarantees that our morality matters, that there are big consequences for our good or evil actions. I personally think there's so much vanity in this that it's comical. Because what I mean, if I'm a religious man, and what I mean, I think, by that attitude is, I go to church, I try to follow the laws and the teachings of my religion. I'm told by the teachers, by the text, that God will forgive me and promise me eternal life if I just perform some minimal duties, or if I just try my best. It seems to me that the religious man enters religion because of a kind of unwritten, unexpressed guarantee that he or she will live, will not die, will not be extinct, will not be annihilated by death. This is a do ut des proposition, in my opinion. Do ut des is Latin, meaning I give so that you might give. Looked at cynically, this is a deal, I think, that I have been religious I was for many years anyway. I'll tell you about that in a second, because I should tell you about that. What am I basing all my observations on? I should tell you. But anyway, so we are religious, number one, because we want moral guarantees, which imply that we're okay. In the end, it's self-interest, of course, that motivates us. And number two, we want deathlessness, a release from death, and assurance that our death will not be our extinction. And once again, if religion cannot give us these things, we're not interested. Even Paul says that. Even Paul says that if we don't survive after death, what use is religion? Okay. Now, where do I come from? I was born and grew up in the States. My mother was Episcopalian, that is, Church of England in America. And I still have strong attachments to that. The Church of England has traditionally, conservatively, put itself halfway between the Church of Rome and other Protestant denominations. It's the via media, or at least it was for Newman, it was for T.S. Eliot and C.S. Lewis and the most famous Anglicans. And Jonathan Swift is a good example, and many others. Okay. Then I remained that way until late in high school, when I started to think and examine things a little bit in my young way, in my silly probably or arrogant way, but okay. Then in college and university, I majored in English but minored in religion, and I had many courses in religion. I had, I think, a pretty good background in religion and theology. Then I went to Europe, studied a lot more, and anyone interested in literature has to be interested in religion anyway. If he or she is not, then he or she is ignorant. And philosophy too. In Europe, I fell in love with European culture, languages, went back to graduate school, studied Dante especially, that is, Catholic theology, and kind of remained an Anglican, Episcopalian through the years, but stopped going to church. Then I went to live in England for a year and a half in Cambridge, and I started going to church again, this time to the Church of England. And I really loved it. I went almost every Sunday when I was not traveling. I loved it. A lot of reading, a lot more philosophical or religious reading. Okay. After I got married, my wife and I became Catholics. She had already become a Catholic, and I became a Catholic for about 2 years, 3 years. I don't know when it ended. It just stopped. But I became disgusted by the arrogance of basically of the Roman Catholic hierarchy, the arrogance of the Vatican, the Catholic arrogance, the arrogance of the Catholic Church, which has changed a little bit now, but I'm afraid it goes very deep. Anyway, so through the years I continued to read and religious or semi-religious things. While teaching at a university, I taught mostly literature courses and foreign language courses, but I also taught religion courses, world religion. I taught that about 3 times, and that was wonderful, because there I had a chance to learn about Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, and I also taught a course several times on mysticism, a subject which really is fascinating and wonderful, and it's on the basis of things like this that I say what I'm saying. I also taught philosophy of religion one time, and I've taken other philosophy courses, blah, blah, blah. So my background, though not complete, is considerable, I think. And I've tried to add to my knowledge of these things, especially over the past 4 years. Because over the past 4 years I've been preparing to write something involving religion and philosophy, involving many of the ideas that I'm talking about now. Not prose in poetry, dramatic poetry, let's call it. Some other time about that. So that's who I am and what how my thoughts have evolved, I suppose. I don't want to imply any disrespect for organized religion. So, I mean, any ideas of mine come from the great thinkers and religious geniuses whom I've read, and much of whose teachings I believe. I think at their best they all say the same thing, that God, whatever God is indescribable. There are no words. This implies that all attempts to anthropomorphize God are kind of childish. Now, I have a problem with that. I don't think childish at all. I think, frankly, we know exactly what we're doing when we treat God as super grandfather. We know exactly what we're doing. We're trying to bring ourselves to the level of God, or God to the level of us. And I think much of religion is an attempt to do just that, frankly. It's our human vanity at work again. Yes, we know how God thinks. Yes, we know what God's opinion about this or this is. As soon as we use words like God think or God's opinion, we are committing this horrible sin of anthropomorphism. As soon as we say God is angry at this or God will punish this, we're committing this horrible sin, I think, of anthropomorphism. We're bringing God down to just kind of one of us, but bigger and stronger. It's childish, I said, but I don't think it is childish, because I think really it's a perfect, yet another but subtle example of human sin. Human arrogance, human pride, human desire to be as God. Even religion is a perfect example, I'm afraid, most of the time, of this. And religion is much more subtle, much more insidious, because after all, we're talking about God. We're talking about spiritual things. But we can't talk about spiritual things without corrupting them. And if we just accept that, we can't talk about God without corrupting. Everything we say corrupts, and mostly it's our human vanity that makes us say these things, I think. And really, Bibles and Qurans are no exception. So much anthropomorphism. These three ideas dominate my thinking about these matters anyway. Anthropomorphism, our tendency to reduce God to ourselves, or the corollary of that, raise ourselves to God's level. 2, disingenuous. We're not innocent when we do this. We know exactly what we're doing. It's part of our game. It's human vanity and human arrogance at work, in my opinion. 3, myth. Myths are all we have. We don't accept that because we want absolute truth. And we want our absolute truth in religion too. And as soon as we want our absolute truth in religion, we are imposing the scientific mentality on religion. Just what we shouldn't do. That's human arrogance. That's human pride, human sin. Now, looking back in Christian history, we have a tendency, students of religion have a tendency to glorify the Middle Ages. There we say religion was supreme. That was the golden age of Christian history, perhaps. Or let's say the initial period, the apostolic period. Nonsense. I think nonsense. Age of faith, I don't believe it. In fact, what the Catholic Church tried to arrive at was absolute truth, and tried to arrive at itself as positing, P-O-S-I-T, as positing itself as the agency of absolute human truth. In other words, What the Catholic Church was to the Middle Ages, science is to modern man. It's the same human tendency to vitiate, V-I-T-I-A-T-E, to corrupt, to compromise, to distort into human vanities anything we touch. This point of view is Lutheran, really. This is Luther talking here a lot. But Luther did it too. Two mythical... I have two... Since I have a few more minutes, I'm going to tell you about two names that I'm using in my poem, and this might interest you. I think it certainly will interest Dr. Shin. In Job, great work. Everything that I have said so far, by the way, I assume is in perfect harmony with Job. Nothing I have said disagrees with Job. Job and Ecclesiastes, I think, for theology, are the best things in the Old Testament. And both emphasize the immensity of God and the triviality and silliness of human pretensions. Okay. In Job, remember, is struck down, loses everything, is afflicted with boils, is in physical pain and great anguish and despair, and his three friends come to visit him. Now, these friends are perfect examples of the religious mentality, because they all consider themselves oh so religious. And in fact, Job has been just like them all his life too. They're sure that they understand how God thinks. They're sure that they understand God's values. They can explain why Job has been punished this way. It must be because he sinned. And then Job, being human, being silly and vain, decides, no, I haven't sinned. And in his arrogance, he even wants to have a trial with God to defend himself against God. What this really means is he wants to prove that God is wrong and he's right. Perfect. It's just, he's really not any better than Zophar and Bildad and Eliphaz, his three friends. In chapter 11 of Job, Zophar speaks, but the same thing happens in some other passages of Job. And Zophar says, blah, 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 we humans can't really understand anything. But then he turns right around and says, well, you see, Job, the reason why you are suffering is blah, 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 blah. You have sinned, and I know this because... What he really means is, I know this because I know exactly how God thinks and how God feels, and I'm speaking for God. Well, I think I'm choosing in my poem, Zopharism equals theology. Theology equals Zopharism. That is, theology at its best begins with the premise, we know nothing. But suddenly, we get all these theories, and we get all these doctrines, and we get all these tenets and creeds, which say, wait, we know a lot. We know exactly how God thinks and feels. We have our little creeds, and our myths, and our stories, and our saints, and the rest of this. So, Zopharism equals theology. But I have a philosophy exemplar that is a perfect example too. This is from literature. One of the masterpieces of Western literature is Voltaire's Candide, in French, written in 1759. Voltaire allegedly, reportedly, wrote it in 2 weeks. That may be a legend, but he wrote fast, but he never wrote anything with the power of this. And in Candide, I'll tell you the story briefly. Candide, whose name basically means innocent, naive, N-A-I, with the 2 dots above it, V-E, gullible, innocent, in other words, not very smart. Candide is a young man who grows up in a castle in Germany. He gets kicked out of the castle in a manner analogous to the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the earthly paradise, Eden, and he wanders. Now, during his youth, he had been taught by a tutor, T-U-T-O-R, named Pangloss. Pangloss, P-A-N-G-L-O-S-S. Pangloss is a philosopher, and Pangloss teaches him and the others his philosophy, which is Voltaire's attack on contemporary, at that time, German philosophy. Pangloss's name means two things. Pan, all, everything. Gloss. Now, gloss has two meanings. One, tongue. It's related to words meaning tongue, so that a glossary is a dictionary of special terms. But we also in English use the term to gloss over things, cover things up, put a shiny cover on things that maybe are not very pretty. Thank you. So, what happens in this book, this wonderful, this profound work, and not fully appreciated, I think. This is not my idea. I was taught this by a professor. I remember when I was in graduate school, he was a guest professor in a summer. I took a summer school course in 18th century French literature, and this man taught me this, and wow, I wonder. Anyway, here's the deal. In this book, then, Candide starts to wander, and he experiences some terrible, terrible things. Meanwhile, the other major characters in the book, including Pangloss, also wander. And we meet other characters who have wandered and experienced terrible things in life. There are some wonderful ideas in here about human nature. One of the ideas is how resilient we are. And it's true, people go through some pretty terrible things and manage to recover. And one thing that helps us recover is talking about things. And so we tell stories to each other and all that. But none of this is the main point. At the end, all of the major characters are reunited and live in Constantinople, in Turkey. And Voltaire intentionally chose some non-Christian territory, Islam, Turks. And Pangloss is still talking. In fact, he's still trying to teach his philosophy, which is hopelessly optimistic about life. A distortion, an obvious distortion, distortion of what life is, or at least what life as these characters have experienced it is. And the very famous ending of the story, of this short novel, is that Pangloss is still talking, and Candide, who we thought maybe was not capable of learning anything, and one wonders, really, a good question is whether any of us are capable of learning anything, even by extreme suffering. But Candide, at least this naive, still kind of innocent young guy, says, yes, 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 all that you're saying is very nice, but we must be quiet and work our garden, cultivate our garden. That's the famous ending. Now, the profundity of this point is the following, that Pangloss, for me, represents philosophy. And this is not to condemn philosophy. Pangloss represents the tendency in us to philosophize, to figure things out, to figure out the universe, to figure out the meaning of life, to figure out who we are and why we are as we are, to figure out almost anything. And what Voltaire seems to be saying is that Pangloss, by talking endlessly, or in other words, that we, by talking endlessly, in the first place, we accomplish nothing. we make no advance, no progress in discovering truth. We only talk. Second, a lot of our talking is actually harmful, and this happens in the book. Am I advocating that we should shut up, that we should stop trying to figure things out? No, because I think it's impossible. We are incapable of being quiet. We are, I believe, animal metaphysicum, as Schopenhauer called us. We have this metaphysical urge to think and see, to try to define and figure out the problems of life. But Pangloss becomes the emblem of philosophy, just as Zophar is the emblem of theology. Bad people, no worse than anybody else. Fools, no more foolish than anyone else probably. The wise, I suspect, are the ones like the Buddha, who doesn't speculate about any of those things. But how many Buddhas do we know? The rest of us will try to figure things out and make absurd statements that have no foundation, absurd assumptions that have no foundation, and we will try to build systems around it. The bad thing is that underlying these tendencies is, I think, human sin. The desire to be as God, to have God's knowledge, to have certitude, certainty. That's what we want. Why? To be as God.